For decades, police investigations in small towns followed a familiar pattern: trust the locals, move quickly, keep things simple. In places where crime was rare and everyone knew each other, investigations were built more on assumption than suspicion. And for a long time, that approach seemed to work. Until one case proved it didn't. Welcome to Darktown Archives, where we examine the moments that quietly changed the way justice works. This story doesn't begin with chaos or violence. It begins with confidence. Confidence that nothing serious could happen here. Confidence that the truth would be obvious. Confidence that the old way of doing things was good enough. This was a small American town where police work felt routine. Officers knew the streets by memory. They knew the families. They knew who belonged and who didn't. That familiarity created comfort, but it also created blind spots. And those blind spots would soon matter. The incident itself seemed straightforward at first. Nothing about it suggested that it would become a national reference point for law enforcement. There were no early warnings that this case would expose flaws in how small-town investigations were conducted. In fact, it was treated like many cases before it: quickly assessed, confidently explained, and quietly closed. But that confidence would not last. What makes this case so important isn't just what happened, it's how investigators initially responded. The early decisions, the assumptions that were made, and the questions that were never asked. Because in small towns, investigations often move fast, not because evidence is strong, but because familiarity creates shortcuts. At Darktown Archives, we've seen how often trust replaces verification in places like this. Officers rely on personal knowledge. Witnesses are believed without challenge. Timelines are accepted without scrutiny. And once a conclusion feels comfortable, it becomes difficult to revisit. That's exactly what happened here. From the beginning, the case followed expectations instead of evidence. The explanation felt logical, the people involved felt familiar, and the town felt reassured. But beneath that reassurance were gaps, small ones at first, that would later force investigators to confront something uncomfortable. They had missed things. Not intentionally, not carelessly, but predictably. Because the system wasn't designed to question itself. As days passed, the case stopped being discussed, reports were filed, the town moved on, and for a while, everything appeared normal again. But behind the scenes, this investigation was quietly becoming something else entirely. A lesson. Years later, when this case would be studied by law enforcement agencies far beyond this town, one realization became clear: the methods used here were common, and that was the problem. This case exposed how easily small-town policing could rely on habit instead of procedure, how assumptions could replace evidence, and how confidence could delay truth. But none of that was obvious at the time. At the beginning, this case looked like success. It looked like efficiency. It looked like proof that small towns didn't need complicated investigations. Until it didn't. Because one detail, overlooked early, refused to disappear. And that detail would eventually force investigators to reopen everything they thought they understood. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a turning point. And once this case was examined closely, it didn't just change one town, it changed how police everywhere began to think about investigating small towns. In the next part, we'll look at how the investigation was first handled and why the methods that once felt effective would soon be questioned. In the early days of the investigation, nothing felt unusual. In fact, everything felt familiar. The officers handling the case had worked in this town for years. They knew the streets, the routines, and the people. That familiarity shaped how the investigation unfolded, quietly, confidently, and without hesitation. From the start, assumptions played a larger role than evidence. Witnesses were interviewed but not challenged. Statements were accepted at face value, especially when they came from people the officers had known for years. There was no sense of urgency to verify every detail because trust already existed. In a small town, trust often feels like proof. At Darktown Archives, we've seen how this dynamic develops. When investigators believe they already understand their community, they stop looking for what doesn't fit. They focus on confirming what feels right instead of questioning what feels off. That was the foundation of this case. The timeline was established quickly, but broadly. Key moments were grouped together instead of examined individually. Certain gaps were brushed aside as unimportant. The belief was simple: If nothing seemed suspicious, there was no reason to search for suspicion. And at first, that logic made sense. The case didn't involve strangers, it didn't involve obvious threats. Everything about it pointed inward, towards people and places that felt familiar, and familiarity creates comfort. Comfort discourages scrutiny. Reports were written efficiently, procedures were followed just enough to feel complete, but crucial steps that would later become standard practice were missing. There was limited cross-checking, little follow-up, no independent review. At the time, no one questioned this approach. Why would they? The town was calm, the explanation satisfied public concern, and the investigation appeared resolved. From the outside, it looked like success. But beneath that surface, small issues were already taking shape. Some details didn't align perfectly, certain statements felt rehearsed rather than recalled, timelines overlapped in ways that weren't fully explained. But these inconsistencies weren't alarming enough to demand attention. They were noted, then quietly set aside. At Dogtown Archives, we often say that investigations fail not when evidence is missing, but when curiosity is missing. This case wasn't built on malice or corruption, it was built on routine. And routine can be dangerous. As days turned into weeks, the case stopped evolving. Once a conclusion was reached, the investigation slowed. New information wasn't actively sought. Alternative explanations weren't explored. The assumption was that the truth had already been found. But that assumption would later become the most critical mistake of all. Years later, when this case would be reviewed by outside agencies, one thing stood out immediately. The investigation followed habits, not protocols. Decisions were guided by familiarity rather than procedure. And while that approach was common in small towns at the time, this case would prove why it needed to change. The shortcuts that once felt efficient now looked risky. This case didn't expose a single error, it exposed a pattern, a way of thinking that prioritized speed and comfort over verification, a system that trusted itself too much to question its own conclusions. And still, none of that was obvious in the moment. To the town, the case was over. To the police, it was another file closed. But beneath that closure was something unresolved, a feeling that the investigation had stopped too soon. That feeling wouldn't go away. Because one overlooked detail, small enough to be ignored early on, would eventually resurface, and when it did, it wouldn't just challenge the outcome of this case, it would challenge the entire approach used to investigate it. In the next part, we'll explore how this case was reopened, and how a single re-examination forced police to confront the weaknesses in their methods. For a long time, the case stayed exactly where the police believed it belonged, closed. It sat quietly in records, referenced only when necessary, rarely questioned. To the town, it was history. To the department, it was routine. But to the truth, it was unfinished. The turning point came years later, and not because of public pressure or media attention. It came through a routine internal review, the kind meant to improve procedures, not reopen old cases. Investigators were asked to examine past files using updated standards. When this case resurfaced, it wasn't expected to stand out. But it did. At Dogtown Archives, we've seen how progress in policing often begins this way, not with accusations, but with reflection. As newer investigators refute the case, they weren't looking for mistakes, they were looking for learning opportunities. What they found was far more significant. The first issue was documentation. Important steps that modern investigations consider essential were either incomplete or missing entirely. Interviews had been summarized instead of recorded in detail. Follow-up questions were never documented. Certain decisions were made without clear justification. At the time, these omissions were common in small-town policing, but viewed through a modern lens, they were impossible to ignore. As the timeline was reconstructed, inconsistencies became clear. Events were grouped together in ways that hid gaps. Some actions appeared to happen simultaneously when they couldn't have. Others were described vaguely without enough detail to verify accuracy. None of these issues alone proved the case was wrong, but together they raised an uncomfortable possibility. The investigation may have reached a conclusion before it fully understood the facts. One detail stood out more than the rest. A piece of information that had been noted early, then quietly dismissed because it didn't align with the accepted explanation. At the time, it was seen as irrelevant. Now, re-examined carefully, it felt critical. Why was it dismissed so quickly? The answer wasn't negligence, it was confidence. Investigators believed they already knew what had happened, so they didn't feel the need to explore information that complicated the narrative. That confidence shaped the entire case. At Dogtown Archives, this is a pattern we see repeatedly. Once investigators believe they have the answer, evidence stops being examined objectively. Anything that supports the conclusion is reinforced, anything that challenges it is minimized. That's what made this re-examination so important. For the first time, the case was viewed without the weight of familiarity. The reviewers didn't know the people involved. They didn't know the town. They had no emotional attachment to the original conclusion. They looked only at the facts, and the gaps between them. And those gaps were significant. As the findings were discussed internally, it became clear that this wasn't just about one case. It was about how investigations had been conducted across many small towns. This case had simply made the problem visible. The department faced a difficult realization. The methods that once felt efficient had allowed assumptions to replace verification, and in this case, that may have altered the outcome. Reopening the case wasn't easy. It meant admitting that the original investigation may have been incomplete. It meant questioning decisions made by respected officers, and it meant accepting that the system itself needed to change. But change wasn't avoidable. This case became a reference point, not because of its conclusion, but because of its process. It showed how easily investigations could drift away from evidence when routine was unchallenged. And it raised a question that could no longer be ignored. If this could happen here, how often had it happened elsewhere? In the next part, we'll explore how this realization spread beyond one department, and how it began to reshape the way police investigate cases in small towns across the country. Once the re-examination was complete, the findings couldn't be ignored. What began as an internal review quietly turned into a broader conversation about how small-town investigations were being conducted, not just in this department but across the country. The issue was no longer whether this case had flaws, it was whether those flaws were common. They were. At Darktown Archives, we often highlight how systems change only when they're forced to confront their own weaknesses. This case did exactly that. It showed how easily familiarity could override procedure, especially in small towns where officers felt deeply connected to their communities. The response wasn't defensive, it was reflective. Departments began asking difficult questions. Should interviews be recorded more thoroughly? Should timelines be independently verified? Should cases be reviewed by someone with no connection?